Well, as always, I think it's a mixed record. So I think a lot of the things you mentioned are quite positive and constructive, like with regard to Honduras. Didn't work, but Brazil did have a positive role. Same with regard to the agreement with Turkey and Iran on low-enriched uranium, which is actually an interesting incident because Brazil was following a policy recommended by the United States. In fact, after the diplomatic flap, Brazil released a letter that Obama had written to Lula recommending exactly what they did. As soon as they did it, the U.S. backed off and rammed through a Security Council resolution which undermined the effort, which could have resolved or at least mitigated whatever conflict there is over Iran. But that was a failed step, but a good one. On the other hand, Haiti is a different story. I think the multinational force in Haiti, MINUSTA, has a very spotty and quite negative role. In fact, a large part of the population wants them out because they're a destructive, occupying force. So that's a different issue, quite apart from the fact that it did introduce cholera into the country, not Brazil, but the force did. So it's generally, again, by comparative standards, one of the better records in the world, but maybe the best, but not spotless. As far as Latin America is concerned, I think it's quite dramatic what's happened in the past 10 years. As you said, it's this used to be the U.S. backyard. It used to be that we have practical sovereignty over the continent, and our law is fiat over the continent. Richard Olney, as late as 1973, when the Nixon administration was planning the overthrow of the Chilean government, the National Security Council warned that if we can't control Latin America, how are we going to control the rest of the world? Well, that's all in the past. Last 10 years, the United States does not control Latin America. South America has pulled out very extensively. There's no military bases left, for example. The United States still has plenty of military personnel operating mainly in Colombia, and in fact building it up, but it's a very different picture from what it was 15 years ago. And in fact, it became very striking at the Cartagena conference just a couple of weeks ago, the hemispheric conference and the summit held in Colombia. It never came out with a formal declaration, and the reason is they couldn't reach agreement on the major issues. One major issue was admission of Cuba, which the U.S. just vetoed. The rest of the hemisphere wanted them in, not Canada. U.S. and Canada rejected it over the overwhelming support of the rest of the hemisphere, Brazil leading the way. And it's very, very unlikely that there'll be another meeting unless Cuba is admitted. So that was one thing. The other was drugs. Most of the hemisphere wants to move towards decriminalization. The United States and Canada flatly reject it. The drug problem is very serious for Latin America. I mean, Mexico, it's a monstrosity. In Colombia, it's one major part of the reason why maybe 150,000 or so people have been killed by paramilitaries in recent years, according to the Attorney General. Not a small thing. Same elsewhere. But the U.S. is adamant. And the problem is in the United States, both the demand problem for drugs and the supply problem, something which is rarely discussed. But the guns mostly come from the United States. We have statistics for Mexico because I studied the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, U.S. government bureau. It does collect guns in Mexico that are confiscated and study them. And their latest report found that about 70% are coming from the United States. Furthermore, their composition has changed. So a couple of years ago, they maybe were pistols. Now they're assault rifles. Next year, there'll be more. That's a problem internal to the United States. You and I can walk into a store in Arizona, pick up an assault rifle, and hand it over to our friendly Mexican cartel member who will pay for it and ship it across the border. And Mexico's suffering from that. 50,000 people killed and the country being torn to shreds. And it goes right down the hemisphere. So the Mexican presidents, and I haven't seen a poll, but I assume a large part of the population want to move towards decriminalization. The U.S. flatly refuses. End result, no announcement from the conference. Well, I think this is a step towards what's likely to happen. Namely, it's very likely that the OAS, Organization of American States, will decline or maybe disappear, U.S. run basically, and it'll be replaced by something like CELAC, the recently formed Organization of Caribbean and Latin American Countries, which excludes the U.S. and Canada. Now, that would have been unimaginable 15 or 20 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. It's a major change in world affairs, and for Latin America, it's really of historic importance. I mean, it's, after all, the first time since the Spanish and Portuguese explorers came 500 years ago. It's the first time that there are successful moves. There have been attempts, but the first time there are successful moves towards some kind of integration, like UNASUR, commercial relations, and so on, and a significant degree of independence. It's a major change in world affairs, and for Latin America, extremely important. And it could be, and partially is, the basis for facing the real scandal of Latin America. I mean, Latin America is very rich, potentially a very rich area. So, for example, if you compare it with East Asia, it has enormous advantages. You know, resources, no conflict, no major conflicts, and so on. But East Asia's developed, Latin America hasn't. And if you look at the reasons, which have been studied, they're pretty straightforward. Latin America, the internal structure of the societies, quite generally, is a very wealthy, a very small, Europeanized, sometimes white elite, and a huge mass of poverty. And the Europeanized elite is internationally oriented, not domestically oriented. One consequence is that countries don't have much to do with each other, even the road systems. I mean, I was in northern Chile a couple of years ago, meeting with Aymara Indians, who are very concerned that their community may in fact disappear, maybe even the language will disappear. You take a look where they are. There is a road that goes right into Bolivia, where the Aymara Indians are running the country, but the connections are so much broken, due to a war, won by England a century ago, that they don't even communicate. Well, that's being overcome. The other effects are revealed simply by comparing imports. So imports into East Asia tend to be capital goods designated for industrial development. Imports into Latin America have typically been concentrated in luxury goods aimed for the tiny elite. Same with capital flight, capital export, where you send your children to go to college or whatever it may be. So East Asia developed pretty much the way the United States did, by violating all the laws of sound economics. Latin America has maybe been the most faithful servant of the IMF, and earlier colonial arrangements were not very different. And we see the results. There was a period of growth in Latin America. It was the period of basically import banned industrialization. But that ended with the neoliberal shift in the 1980s. And now it's beginning to resume. It took place under very ugly conditions, like in Brazil. There was economic growth, but under a kind of like, neo-Nazi military dictatorship that's substantially, very strongly supported by the U.S., even its imposition. But there was growth, and the same throughout the hemisphere. Changed very sharply in the 80s with the imposition of what's called sound economics. And now there's kind of liberation from that. And maybe these internal problems can be seriously faced. They're very striking. You see it in every country. So take, say, Bolivia. What happened in Bolivia is quite remarkable. The most repressed part of the population in the continent, indigenous population, actually took over. That's pretty remarkable. But there's a quick, immediate backlash from the eastern area, where the most of the resources happen to be, and which is under the control of the traditional Europeanized, partially white elite, and they want to, actually they want to secede, but they certainly want at least autonomy. They want to block the indigenous-based development model, and it became pretty brutal. I mean, there were dozens of peasants killed and so on. It looked like a civil war might break out. Well, at that point there was an intervention by UNASUR, which Brazil led in many ways, which was pretty successful. It prevented it and restored governmental authority. These things don't end, but there are moves in a positive direction, and all of that is enormously significant. I mean, the U.S. at this point doesn't even try to control Latin America. As you could see at Cartagena, it may be excluded from the hemisphere, which is a really dramatic change. It's actually, things like that have been happening for a long time. The U.S. domination of the world, which was overwhelming in the 1940s, has been declining ever since. It started declining in the 1940s, in fact, with China moving towards independence. But it's been continuing since, still overwhelming, but nothing like it was. And the what's called the loss of Latin America, meaning the move towards independence in Latin America, is a really significant part of it, not just for Latin Americans, for the whole world system. And Brazil's, to get back to your point, Brazil's efforts to assume a more significant role in the international system are part of this. So far they haven't really succeeded very much, but there's steps, I think, in a good direction. Examples include what you described, like the Turkish agreement with Iran, which was abortive, but a very positive move. Others were, and it's happening all the time. So, for example, in the Libya attack on Libya, which was really just the three imperial powers, traditional imperial powers, France, England, and the United States. There was overwhelming opposition in the world in favor of at least an effort to undertake diplomacy and negotiations to try to head off a humanitarian crisis, which in fact took place. And Brazil was a leading part of it. The BRICS countries, with Brazil playing a major role, were opposed. Africa was opposed. Turkey was opposed. And similarly on the case of Iran, which is a major issue that could break out into a horrible war. And once again, the United States and Europe are pretty isolated. If you look at world opinion, it isn't, it's almost never reported. But if you actually look at how the world lines up on this issue, the United States and its European allies are on one side. On the other side is virtually the rest of the world. China and Russia plainly aren't part of it. India flatly rejects it. In fact, is increasing its development and trade relations with Iran. Turkey's increasing its commercial relations. The Arab world is extremely interesting. What's reported is that the Arabs support the United States on Iran. But that's a reference to the Arab dictators, the sort of contempt for democracy among intellectual elites. We're back to ideology again. The contempt for democracy is so profound that if the dictators support us, that means the Arabs support us. Now, what about public opinion? Well, if you have real contempt for democracy, you don't care. But we know a lot about Arab public opinion. It's studied regularly by the leading Western polling agencies, indigenous ones as well, and they come out with essentially the same results. The Arab world doesn't like Iran. There's old conflicts that go back to Persian-Arab conflicts way back. So they don't like Iran, but they don't regard Iran as a threat. A few percent regard Iran as a threat. They regard the United States as a threat. And in fact, opposition and Israel, which they regard as kind of like an appendage of the United States. In fact, opposition to U.S. policy is so strong that a majority, and in some countries like Egypt, a considerable majority, think that the region would be better off if Iran had nuclear weapons. The isolation of the traditional imperial powers is quite extreme. You would not guess this from reading either the media or even the professional literature, professional, say, foreign policy and political science literature. It's not the impression they give, but it's a fact. With Libya, it was similar, and Brazil has a significant role in this. Could have a more significant role. Take, say, the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's never discussed in the West, but the fact is that though there has been for decades an international consensus on a solution, at least a settlement, a short-term settlement, two-state settlement. It's been blocked by the United States and cannot get anywhere because the U.S. and Israel impose crucial preconditions on negotiations. Now, that's not what's said, because the ideology is the United States is a neutral arbiter and full of goodwill and so on. That's a kind of dogma. So you can't discuss it. But the fact of the matter is the U.S. rejectionism has been blocking a settlement. The precondition for negotiations is that the U.S. must run them. Well, that makes about as much sense as saying that, say, Shiite, Sunni conflicts in Iraq should be mediated by Iran. If anybody said that, you'd laugh. Well, this is quite similar. That precondition guarantees that nothing will happen. If there was a serious negotiating process, it would be managed by some neutral party that has some international credibility. And there's no better choice than Brazil. It has a lot of international credibility. It's kind of a neutral party. But you can't even mention that in the West would elicit total incomprehension. Another sign of the depth of imperial ideology. You just can't conceive that anything can happen unless the traditional imperial powers run it, which makes it neutral. Well, these ideological commitments are very profound, and they're pervasive. You find them everywhere. But Brazil could help lead the way in breaking that down, and I think is already doing so, even if the early attempts have been abortive.